Welcome to Military where we dive deep into the battles that changed everything but somehow got forgotten by the history books. Today, we're uncovering one of the most shocking upsets in American military history, a story so incredible that when you hear what actually happened, you'll wonder why every American doesn't know this tale by heart. Picture this. It's a bitter cold morning in January 1781. The American Revolution is gasping for its last breath. The British have crushed every major American force in the South cities have fallen. Armies have surrendered. The dream of independence seems to be dying a slow, agonizing death. But in the rolling countryside of South Carolina, something extraordinary is about to unfold. A grizzled frontiersman is about to orchestrate a military miracle that will leave British commanders scratching their heads and rewriting their tactical manuals. What makes this battle absolutely mind-blowing isn't just that a bunch of American farmers won, it's how they won. They took every single rule of warfare, threw it out the window, and created a strategy so brilliant and counterintuitive that their enemy walked straight into a trap that would echo through military academies for centuries. This is the story of how ordinary men with extraordinary courage changed the course of a war and a nation. The year 1780 had been an absolute disaster for American forces in the southern colonies. After the catastrophic defeat at Camden, where an American general literally fled the battlefield faster than his own troops, morale had hit rock bottom. The British war machine seemed unstoppable. Under the iron command of Lord Cornwallis, a seasoned veteran of European warfare, they were systematically conquering the southern colonies with brutal efficiency that struck fear into the hearts of patriots everywhere. Cornwallis wasn't just winning battles, he was implementing a strategy of terror and intimidation that had already brought Georgia and much of South Carolina under complete British control. The situation was so desperate that many patriots had simply given up. They were hanging up their weapons and trying to blend back into civilian life. Loyalist militias were popping up throughout the South, often using British protection as an excuse to settle old scores with their patriot neighbors. It genuinely looked like the revolution might just collapse entirely in the South, leaving only New England and the mid-Atlantic states to continue a fight that seemed increasingly hopeless. But there was one man who refused to accept defeat. Nathanael Greene, the new Southern commander personally appointed by George Washington himself, had a vision that was so radical, it seemed insane. Greene was a Rhode Island Quaker who had actually been kicked out of his religious community for taking up arms. He was a man who combined brilliant strategic thinking with an intimate understanding of Southern geography and culture that most Northern commanders completely lacked. Instead of trying to match British strength with strength, which had failed catastrophically at Camden, Greene made a decision that violated every military manual ever written. He would divide his forces. Every military expert would tell you this was suicide. You never split your army when facing a superior enemy. But Greene understood something that the textbooks didn't. He knew the nature of warfare in the American South was completely different from the European battlefields where traditional military wisdom had been developed. The American South was a vast wilderness of forests, swamps, and rivers where conventional European tactics often fell apart completely. Here, local knowledge mattered more than drill manual precision. The support of the civilian population could make the difference between victory and total annihilation. Greene sent Daniel Morgan west with about 1,000 men while he took the main force east. This would force Cornwallis to split his own army to pursue both American forces, potentially weakening both British detachments. Cornwallis took the bait exactly as Greene had hoped. The British commander, supremely confident in his superior training and equipment, decided to divide his own forces to pursue both American armies simultaneously. He sent his most aggressive and successful subordinate to hunt down Morgan's western force. This decision would prove to be one of the most fateful mistakes of the entire war. The man Cornwallis chose for this mission was Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, known throughout the South by the terrifying nickname Bloody Ban. At just 26 years old, this cavalry officer had built a reputation for ruthless pursuit and merciless treatment of defeated enemies that made him the most feared British commander in the Southern theater. Born into a wealthy Liverpool merchant family, Tarleton had purchased his commission and risen rapidly through the ranks through a combination of natural military talent and absolute ruthlessness that shocked even his own allies. Tarleton commanded the British Legion, a mixed force of cavalry and infantry recruited largely from American loyalists. He had built his fearsome reputation through a series of crushing victories against Patriot forces, but his most infamous moment had come at a place called the Waxhaws. There, according to American accounts, he had massacred Patriot forces who were attempting to surrender, earning him the nickname Butcher and making the phrase Tarleton's Quarter synonymous with no mercy given. The psychological impact of Tarleton's reputation cannot be overstated. Many American militia units would simply flee at the first report of his approach, without even attempting to fight. If anyone could catch and destroy Morgan's force, it was this young British cavalry commander. His British Legion moved with lightning speed through the South Carolina backcountry, covering distances that seemed impossible and appearing where enemies least expected them. Cornwallis had given Tarleton explicit orders: find Morgan and destroy his force completely, leaving no organized American resistance in the Western Carolinas. Daniel Morgan, meanwhile, was a completely different type of soldier. Born on the Virginia frontier, he had spent his youth as a teamster and laborer before joining the military during the French and Indian War. Unlike the aristocratic Tarleton, Morgan had risen through the ranks through merit alone, earning his position through demonstrated courage and tactical brilliance rather than wealth or family connections. Morgan's early military experience had been harsh and formative. As a young man, he had struck a British officer during a dispute and received 499 lashes as punishment, one less than the 500 that would have killed him outright. This brutal treatment had left him with a deep understanding of both British military methods and their limitations, as well as an intimate knowledge of what motivated common soldiers to fight and die. During the early years of the Revolution, Morgan had commanded a unit of Virginia riflemen whose marksmanship and woodcraft had made them legendary throughout the Continental Army. These men could hit targets at ranges that seemed impossible to European-trained soldiers, and they fought with a frontier independence that often frustrated conventional commanders, but proved devastatingly effective in the right circumstances. Now, in late 1780, Morgan was 44 years old and suffering from arthritis and sciatica that left him barely able to ride a horse for extended periods. But his mind remained razor-sharp, and his understanding of both conventional and unconventional warfare was unmatched among American commanders. He knew he was being hunted by the most dangerous British commander in the South, and he knew that his force was exactly the kind of mixed unit that usually fell apart under pressure from professional European soldiers. If you're fascinated by these incredible stories of American courage and tactical genius that changed the course of history, make sure to hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what you think about Morgan's impossible situation, and definitely subscribe to our channel because we've got so many more amazing forgotten battles and brilliant strategies from American history that will absolutely blow your mind. Morgan's army was indeed a ragtag collection that would have made European military observers shake their heads in disbelief. His corps consisted of about 300 Continental regulars, professional soldiers who had enlisted for the duration of the war and received training in European-style linear tactics. But the majority of his force consisted of militia, farmers, shopkeepers, and frontiersmen who served for short terms and had minimal formal military training. The militia were notorious throughout the war for their unreliability in conventional battle. Time and again, militia units had fired a few scattered shots and then melted away when faced with British regulars advancing with fixed bayonets. Even George Washington, who respected the militia's value in guerrilla warfare, had little faith in their ability to stand toe-to-toe with professional soldiers in open battle. But Morgan understood his men better than most commanders ever would. He knew that the militia's tendency to retreat wasn't necessarily cowardice. It was often sound tactical sense. These were citizen soldiers with families and farms to return to. They couldn't afford to die in futile heroic stands that accomplished nothing. but if given a role that matched their capabilities and psychology, they could be absolutely devastating. As Tarleton closed in during the second week of January 1781, Morgan made a decision that seemed like military suicide to anyone watching. Instead of continuing to retreat toward the relative safety of the North Carolina mountains, he decided to make a stand. But where he chose to fight seemed to guarantee his own destruction. The place was called Cowpens, named for the cattle pens that local farmers had built in the area. It was a relatively open stretch of rolling grassland, dotted with scattered trees and surrounded by denser forest. Most importantly, from a military perspective, it had a broad river at its back, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Every military principle screamed that this was wrong. The most basic rule of warfare was to never fight with a major obstacle behind you that would prevent withdrawal. Armies needed escape routes. Soldiers fought better knowing they could fall back if things went badly. But Morgan understood something about psychology that his British opponent didn't grasp. Sometimes when men know they can't retreat, they fight harder than they ever thought possible. The knowledge that flight was impossible could focus the mind wonderfully and turn ordinary soldiers into heroes. Moreover, Morgan had spent months studying his enemy, and he knew Tarleton's weaknesses intimately. Tarleton was undoubtedly brave and tactically competent, but he was also impetuous and arrogant. His string of easy victories against American forces had made him dangerously overconfident, and he had developed a tendency to attack immediately upon contact, rather than taking time for proper reconnaissance and preparation. Morgan was betting that Tarleton's eagerness for another quick victory would blind him to the trap being prepared. On the night of January 16th, 1781, Morgan gathered his officers and explained his battle plan. What he proposed was so unconventional that some of his subordinates thought their commander had finally cracked under the pressure of constant retreat and pursuit. Morgan planned to arrange his forces in 3 lines, but not the way any European army would deploy them. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity and psychological insight. Instead of trying to make his militia behave like continental regulars, Morgan would use them exactly as they were, men who would fight for a while and then retreat when pressed too hard. But he would make that natural tendency part of his battle plan rather than a weakness to be overcome. In the front line, about 150 yards forward of his main position, Morgan placed his least reliable troops, local militia armed with hunting rifles. These were farmers and frontiersmen who were excellent individual marksmen but had little experience in formal military maneuvers. Morgan's instructions to them were refreshingly honest and practical. He didn't expect them to stand and fight like continental soldiers. He wanted them to fire 2 volleys, aim for the officers, and then retreat behind the second line. They shouldn't be ashamed of retreating. It was their job, and they would be helping win the battle by doing exactly what came naturally to them. This was military heresy of the highest order. Conventional wisdom held that you put your best troops in front to absorb the enemy's initial assault. But Morgan was thinking several moves ahead like a chess master. He wanted the British to see American militia retreating because that would make them overconfident and careless in their pursuit. Behind the first line, about 150 yards back, he placed his second line more experienced militia under the command of Andrew Pickens, a Presbyterian elder who had proven himself as a partisan fighter. These men had more military experience than the first line, and their job was to slow down the British advance with disciplined volleys before falling back to reform on the flanks of the third line. The third line, positioned on a low hill that dominated the battlefield, consisted of Morgan's most reliable troops, Continental regulars under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard and Virginia militia, who had proven themselves in previous battles. These men would have to absorb the main British assault after it had been weakened and disrupted by the first 2 lines. Finally, Morgan positioned Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's cavalry behind the hill, completely out of sight of approaching enemies. Washington, a distant cousin of the commander-in-chief, commanded about 80 Continental dragoons and mounted militia. These men would provide the decisive striking power at the crucial moment when everything hung in the balance. The genius of Morgan's plan lay in its understanding of both his own men's psychology and that of his enemies. He was using his army's perceived weaknesses as strengths, turning the natural fighting instincts of citizen soldiers into tactical advantages, rather than trying to force them into European military molds that simply didn't fit American conditions. But the plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each line had to perform its role precisely, and the cavalry had to strike at exactly the right moment. Most challenging of all, the plan required Morgan's men to trust him completely, even when everything seemed to be going horribly wrong and defeat appeared certain. As dawn broke on January 17th, 1781, Tarleton's force appeared through the morning mist like something out of a nightmare. The British commander had pushed his men hard through the night, covering the final distance to Cowpens in darkness to achieve tactical surprise. He had about 1,100 men, slightly larger than Morgan's force and vastly superior in training, equipment, and recent battle experience. If you're loving this incredible story of tactical genius and want to see how this impossible gamble played out, smash that like button and let us know in the comments what you think Morgan's chances were. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because we're just getting to the most mind-blowing part of this forgotten masterpiece of American military history. American military history. What happened next at Cowpens became one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history. Morgan's unconventional three-line strategy worked exactly as planned. His militia fired their volleys and retreated just as he'd instructed, luring Tarleton's overconfident British forces into a devastating trap. When the moment was perfect, Washington's hidden cavalry thundered out from behind the hill, while the militia reformed on the flanks, completely encircling the stunned British army. In less than an hour, these supposedly unreliable American farmers had achieved the impossible. They captured over 500 British soldiers, killed or wounded hundreds more, and sent the dreaded Bloody Band fleeing for his life. The psychological impact was enormous. This wasn't just a military victory. It was proof that American forces could outthink and outfight the finest professional army in the world. Cowpens changed everything. It restored American confidence throughout the South, provided a tactical blueprint that influenced military thinking for generations, and helped set the stage for the final British surrender at Yorktown. Most importantly, it showed that ordinary citizens fighting for their homes and freedom could achieve extraordinary things when led by commanders who understood their true strengths. The legacy of this forgotten battle extends far beyond the Revolutionary War. Morgan's innovative use of what others saw as weaknesses, his psychological understanding of both his own troops and his enemy, and his willingness to break every conventional rule to achieve victory became hallmarks of the American military tradition that continue to this day. Daniel Morgan proved that sometimes the most brilliant strategy is the one that dares to do what everyone else says is impossible. These farmers didn't just crush a British column, they helped forge the tactical genius that would define American warfare for centuries to come.